My name is Ethan, and for almost 10 years I worked as a park ranger in one of the largest forests in Montana. Most people think being a ranger is all about hiking, watching wildlife, and helping tourists who get lost. The truth is that most nights are incredibly boring. You spend hours driving through empty roads, checking campsites, and making sure nobody's breaking the rules. Over the years, I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, drunk campers, and more emergencies than I can count. After a while, you stop getting scared of things. You learn to trust your training and focus on facts instead of stories. That's why I always laughed whenever locals talked about the strange things hidden deep in those woods. They all had stories about hearing voices, seeing figures between the trees, or getting lost in places they knew well. But one cold October night, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about that forest. It was a little after 11 p.m. when my radio suddenly crackled to life while I was sitting alone in the ranger station. The voice on the other end sounded shaky, like someone who had been running for a long time and was completely out of breath. At first, I could barely understand what he was saying because the signal kept cutting in and out. The only words I clearly heard were, "I think someone is following me." I immediately asked for his name and location, but all I got back was heavy breathing and bursts of static. Then he said something that sent a strange chill through me, even though I didn't think much of it at the time. He said that he kept hearing whistling in the woods, but every time he followed the sound, it seemed to move farther away. Before I could ask any more questions, the transmission completely died. I tried calling him back several times, but there was no response. According to the GPS ping from the radio system, the signal had come from an old hiking trail in a remote part of the forest that almost nobody visited anymore. I grabbed my gear, got into my truck, and started heading toward the location. The drive took almost an hour because the trailhead was deep inside the park and far away from the main roads. The deeper I drove into the forest, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. Eventually, there were no lights at all, except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees on both sides of the road seemed endless, forming walls of black shadows that stretched far beyond what I could see. Normally, I enjoyed being out there at night because the forest felt peaceful. That night was different for reasons I couldn't explain. There was this strange feeling sitting in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the fear in the man's voice, or maybe it was just the isolation of being completely alone. Either way, by the time I reached the trailhead, I already felt more uneasy than I wanted to admit. The parking area was completely empty when I arrived. There were no cars, no campers, and no signs that anyone else had been there recently. That immediately struck me as odd, because if the man had called for help, his vehicle should have been somewhere nearby. I stepped out of the truck and was hit by the kind of silence that only exists deep in the wilderness. There were no insects chirping, no distant animal sounds, and not even much wind moving through the trees. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my radio, and started walking down the trail. The beam from my flashlight stretched ahead into the darkness, lighting up patches of dirt, roots, and fallen leaves. Every few minutes I called out in case the missing hiker was close enough to hear me. The only answer was the sound of my own voice echoing through the trees. About 20 minutes into the hike, I found the first sign that someone had actually been there. There were fresh footprints pressed into the damp ground just off the trail. They looked like hiking boot prints and seemed to be heading deeper into the forest. That didn't make much sense because experienced hikers usually stay on marked paths, especially at night. As I continued following him, I noticed something strange. There was only one set of footprints. There were no signs that another person had been walking with him or chasing him. If someone really had been following him, there should have been evidence of that somewhere. But there wasn't. A few minutes later, I heard the whistle for the first time. It was faint and distant, almost blending into the night. At first, I thought it might be a bird, because certain birds can make surprisingly human-sounding noises. Then I heard it again. The sound was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably made by a person. It wasn't a tune or a song. It was just a simple whistle made up of 3 short notes. I stopped and listened carefully. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me. I called out and asked if anyone was there. The whistle immediately stopped. For a few seconds, everything went silent again, and then the exact same whistle came from somewhere behind me. I spun around and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there except trees and shadows. The whistle came again, this time from my left, then from somewhere farther away to my right. It didn't make any sense. No one could move around that quickly without making noise. If someone was messing with me, they were doing an incredible job of staying hidden. I tried convincing myself that sound travels strangely in forests at night. Maybe echoes were bouncing between the trees and making it seem like the source was moving. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't feel right. The whistle sounded too clear and too intentional. It felt like someone wanted me to hear it. I kept moving forward because I still had a missing person to find. About 10 minutes later, I came across a backpack sitting beside a fallen log. The sight of it instantly made my stomach tighten. People don't usually leave their backpacks behind in the middle of nowhere. I knelt down and opened it. Inside were snacks, a water bottle, a flashlight, and a wallet. Everything looked normal except for the fact that it had all been abandoned. The driver's license inside identified the owner as Michael Turner. That was likely the same man who had called for help. If he left his backpack behind voluntarily, he must have been terrified. If he didn't leave it voluntarily, then something much worse had happened. As I stood up, the whistle returned. This time it was much closer than before. It sounded like it came from somewhere just beyond the trees ahead of me. The hair on the back of my neck immediately stood up. Without thinking, I swept my flashlight across the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing between 2 large pine trees. The figure was tall and completely motionless. I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The moment the beam hit the spot, the figure was gone. There wasn't enough time for anyone to run away. 1 second it was there, and the next second it wasn't. That's when I felt the first real surge of fear. I told myself I was imagining things and started heading back toward the trail. The missing backpack was enough evidence for me to call in additional help. But after walking for several minutes, I realized something was wrong. The trail should have been directly ahead of me. Instead, I found myself surrounded by unfamiliar trees and thick undergrowth. Somehow, I had lost the path completely. That shouldn't have been possible, because I had years of experience navigating these woods. I stopped and checked my GPS. The screen flickered for a moment and then went completely blank. At almost the exact same moment, the whistle sounded again. Only this time it wasn't distant. It came from somewhere so close that it felt like whoever made it was standing right behind me. The sound was so close that every instinct in my body told me to turn around immediately. Instead, I froze for a second and listened. Whoever or whatever had made that whistle wasn't moving anymore. The forest had gone completely silent again, and that somehow felt even worse. Slowly, I turned around and swept my flashlight across the trees behind me. Nothing was there, at least nothing that I could clearly see. The beam moved across dozens of tree trunks, patches of brush, and thick shadows that seemed darker than the night around them. My heart was pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I've been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. It felt like something was watching me and waiting for me to make a mistake. I pulled my radio off my belt and tried contacting dispatch again. All I got back was static. Then, for a brief second, I heard a voice. It was too distorted to understand, but it definitely sounded human. I repeated my location and requested backup, hoping someone could hear me. The radio crackled loudly and then went dead again. That's when I noticed something strange. The battery indicator showed full power only a few minutes earlier. Now it was nearly empty. I checked my flashlight too, and it seemed dimmer than before. The deeper I looked into the forest, the more it felt like the darkness itself was swallowing the light. I hated the thought, but I was starting to feel genuinely trapped. I decided the smartest thing to do was stay calm and find my way back to the truck. Panicking in the wilderness only makes situations worse. I picked a direction that should have taken me toward the trail and started walking. For about 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. Then I came across the same fallen log with Michael's backpack sitting beside it. I stopped dead in my tracks. There was absolutely no way I should have ended up back there. I'd been walking in what I believed was the opposite direction, yet somehow I had returned to the exact same spot. Seeing that backpack again made my stomach drop. For the first time, I wondered if I was dealing with something that couldn't be explained. I left the backpack where it was and started moving again. This time, I paid close attention to landmarks around me. I even used my pocket knife to make small marks on several tree trunks as I walked. The idea was simple. If I ended up walking in circles again, I would know immediately. For a while, the plan seemed to work. Then I spotted one of my knife marks ahead of me. My pulse quickened. A few steps later, I saw another mark, then another. Somehow I had made a complete loop through the forest without realizing it. That should have been impossible given the route I had taken. The whistle returned before I could process what was happening. This time it sounded almost playful. It echoed through the trees like someone enjoying a private joke. I shouted into the darkness and demanded that whoever was out there show themselves. The whistle stopped instantly. For several seconds there was nothing but silence. Then I heard something else. It sounded like footsteps moving through leaves somewhere off to my right. The steps were slow and deliberate. They weren't trying to hide. Whoever was making them wanted me to know they were there. The sound continued for several moments before suddenly stopping. I aimed my flashlight toward the noise and caught a glimpse of movement. A tall figure slipped behind a tree just as the beam reached it. I took off running toward the spot. The distance wasn't more than 50 yards. I reached the tree within seconds. There was nobody there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Then I noticed a smell in the air. It was faint but unmistakable. It smelled like damp earth mixed with something rotten. The smell grew stronger as I continued forward. Eventually, I entered a small clearing I didn't remember seeing on any map. The moonlight barely reached the ground through the dense canopy above. In the center of the clearing stood an old wooden structure. It looked like a hunting cabin that had been abandoned for decades. The wood was warped and dark from years of exposure to the weather. Several windows were broken. The front door hung slightly open. I'd worked in that forest for years, and never heard of a cabin being there. That alone was enough to make me uneasy, but what really bothered me was that the door appeared to be moving slowly on its own. Every rational part of my brain told me not to go inside. Unfortunately, curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin cautiously and pushed the door open. The interior was almost completely dark. My flashlight revealed old furniture covered in dust and layers of decay. The place looked abandoned, but something felt wrong. The dust on the floor wasn't undisturbed. There were marks everywhere. It looked like something had been moving through the cabin recently. Then I saw the wall. Hundreds of scratches covered the wood. Some were shallow, others looked deep enough to have been carved with a knife. Whatever made them had done so over a very long period of time. As I examined the scratches, my flashlight beam landed on something that immediately made my blood run cold. Written across one section of the wall were dozens of names. Some looked recent, others had almost faded away completely. Near the bottom of the list was a name I recognized, Michael Turner, the missing hiker. His name had been carved into the wood. Underneath it were 3 words, "Don't follow it." I stared at the message, trying to understand what it meant. Then the whistle sounded again. This time it came from inside the cabin. The sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the darkness behind me. Every muscle in my body locked up. There was no way another person could have entered the cabin without me hearing him, yet the whistle had clearly come from inside the room. Slowly I turned around. My flashlight shook slightly in my hand. The beam swept across the darkness until it landed on a doorway leading into another part of the cabin. For a moment, everything looked empty. Then I saw it. A tall silhouette standing perfectly still inside the doorway. And unlike before, this one didn't disappear when the light touched it. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The figure stood there completely still, almost like it was waiting for me to make the first move. My flashlight beam was pointed directly at it, yet I still couldn't make out any details. It looked less like a person and more like a human-shaped shadow. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed. Its arms looked unusually long, hanging lower than they should have. I tried telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coat hanging on a wall or some strange trick of the light. Then the figure tilted its head slightly to one side. That's when I knew it wasn't my imagination. I took a step backward without taking my eyes off it. The floorboards creaked loudly beneath my boots. The figure remained motionless. My heart was hammering against my chest so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to leave immediately, but another part of me needed to know what I was looking at. I called out and asked if it was Michael. There was no response. The figure simply stood there in silence. Then, very slowly, it raised one arm and pointed toward a dark hallway behind it. The movement was unnatural, almost jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. I wish I could say I turned around and ran right then. Looking back, that's exactly what I should have done. Instead, I stood there frozen, trying to understand what was happening. The figure kept pointing toward the hallway. Then I heard something else. A faint voice drifted through the darkness. At first, it sounded like distant whispering. Then I realized someone was saying my name. The voice was soft and almost impossible to hear clearly. It sounded like someone begging for help, and for some reason it seemed to be coming from the same direction the figure was pointing. The possibility that Michael might still be alive changed everything. If there was even a chance someone needed help, I couldn't just walk away. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and moved toward the hallway. The figure didn't stop me. In fact, it slowly stepped aside as I approached. The closer I got, the colder the air became. It felt like walking into a giant freezer. My breath started becoming visible in front of me. The hallway stretched farther back than seemed possible for a cabin of that size. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but I kept moving forward anyway. The whispering grew louder with every step. At times it sounded like one person. Other times it sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once. None of the words made sense. They blended together into a strange murmur that echoed through the hallway. The walls were covered in more scratches, some fresh enough to expose the lighter wood underneath. I kept scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Every shadow seemed to move at the edge of my vision. Whenever I turned to look directly at 'em, nothing was there. The entire place felt alive somehow. It felt like the cabin was watching me. Eventually, the hallway opened into a larger room. The moment my flashlight swept across it, I stopped breathing for a second. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some were carved deeply into the wood, while others looked hastily scratched into the surface. There were dates next to many of them. The oldest date I noticed was from the 1950s. The newest was only a few weeks old. My stomach tightened as I scanned the wall. Then I found Michael Turner's name again. This time there was a date beside it from just 3 days earlier. I moved closer to examine the writing. That's when I noticed something written underneath his name. The message looked rushed, like it had been carved by someone in a hurry. It simply said, "It copies voices." A cold wave of dread ran through me. I immediately remembered the radio call. I remembered hearing someone say my name moments ago. Suddenly, I wasn't sure whether any voice I'd heard in the forest could be trusted. The realization hit me hard. Whatever was out there might not have been trying to communicate. It might have been trying to lure people deeper into the woods. And if that was true, I had walked right into its trap. A loud bang suddenly echoed through the cabin. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. The sound had come from somewhere behind me. It was followed by another bang, then another. It sounded like doors slamming shut one after another. The whispering immediately stopped. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Every hair on my body stood up. I slowly backed away from the wall of names. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, and they were getting closer. The footsteps didn't sound human. They were too slow and too heavy. Each step was followed by a deep creaking sound, as if something unusually large was moving through the building. I turned off my flashlight instinctively and crouched behind an old wooden table. The room was plunged into darkness. The footsteps continued approaching, closer and closer. I held my breath and listened. Whatever was coming down that hallway wasn't in a hurry. It sounded completely confident, as if it already knew exactly where I was. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. Then I heard a familiar voice from the hallway. My blood turned to ice immediately. The voice belonged to my younger brother. The problem was that my brother lived over 1,000 miles away. In a calm and friendly tone, the voice called my name and told me everything was okay. Then it asked me to come out. The voice sounded perfect. Every detail was exactly right. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was standing outside that room was not my brother. I stayed completely still behind the table and forced myself not to respond. Every part of me wanted to answer because the voice sounded exactly like my brother. It wasn't close to being similar. It was perfect. The tone, the pace, even the way he pronounced certain words were identical. If I had closed my eyes, I would have sworn he was standing right outside the room. The voice called my name again and told me that he had come to help me. Then it laughed softly, in the same way my brother always did. That's when I realized something even more terrifying. It wasn't just copying voices, it somehow knew personal details. The voice continued speaking for several minutes. It talked about childhood memories that only my family would know. It mentioned fishing trips we took when we were kids. It mentioned the old cabin our grandfather owned. It even brought up a conversation my brother and I had only a few months earlier. Every word made the fear inside me grow stronger. Whatever this thing wasn't randomly imitating people. It seemed capable of pulling memories from somewhere. The realization made me feel exposed in a way I'd never experienced before. It felt like something had crawled inside my mind and was searching through my life. I remained silent and prayed it wouldn't come into the room. For a while, nothing happened. The voice stopped talking. The hallway outside became silent again. I waited another minute before carefully peeking over the edge of the table. The doorway was empty. There was no movement, no sound, no sign that anything had ever been there. I considered making the run for it right then, but before I could move, I noticed something on the floor near the doorway. It hadn't been there earlier. A fresh message had been scratched into the wood. The letters looked jagged and uneven. It simply said, "Still here." My stomach dropped the moment I read those words. Whatever was in the cabin knew exactly where I was. The message wasn't old. The wood around the scratches was still fresh and pale. Somehow it had appeared without making a sound. I slowly stood up and backed away from the doorway. My flashlight remained off because I didn't want to reveal my position. The darkness felt suffocating around me. Every shadow seemed to contain something waiting to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching from every corner of the room. The longer I stayed there, the stronger that feeling became. Then I heard another voice. This time it belonged to my mother. She had passed away several years earlier. Hearing her voice in that cabin nearly broke me. She sounded exactly as I remembered her. Warm, calm, and comforting. She softly called my name and asked where I was. For a moment I felt tears building in my eyes. My brain knew it couldn't be real, but my heart desperately wanted to believe it was. The voice sounded so genuine that it physically hurt to ignore it. That's exactly why I knew it was a trap. The voice of my mother slowly moved through the hallway. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes it sounded far away. It called for me over and over, then it started crying. The sound echoed through the cabin and made my skin crawl. Something about those cries felt wrong. They were almost convincing, but not completely. It was like listening to an actor trying to imitate real sadness. There was emotion there, but it felt artificial somehow. The thing mimicking my mother understood how people sounded. It just didn't fully understand what being human actually felt like. I decided I couldn't stay hidden any longer. Every minute inside that cabin felt more dangerous than the last. Slowly, I moved toward a broken window on the far side of the room. My plan was simple: climb out, get as far away from the cabin as possible, and find my way back to the truck. The window was barely large enough to fit through. I carefully pushed aside loose pieces of wood and glass. The cold night air hit my face immediately. For the first time in what felt like hours, I could see the forest again. It looked dark and threatening, but it still seemed safer than the cabin. Just as I started climbing through the window, I heard a loud crash behind me. I turned instinctively. Something had entered the room. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It was too dark. Then my flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor. The beam landed directly on the figure. I finally saw it clearly for the first time. The thing was incredibly tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin. Its skin looked pale gray, almost like old tree bark, and its face was completely wrong. It looked like someone had tried to build a human face from memory and gotten most of the details slightly incorrect. The creature didn't move immediately. It simply stood there staring at me. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. Its mouth hung open slightly, revealing rows of teeth that looked far too long. What terrified me most wasn't its appearance. It was the expression on its face. There wasn't any anger, there wasn't any hunger, there wasn't any emotion at all. It looked at me the same way a scientist might examine an insect. I felt completely insignificant standing there, like I was nothing more than another object it had discovered in the forest. Then the creature smiled. The movement was slow and unnatural. Its mouth stretched wider than seemed possible. As it smiled, it spoke in my own voice. It perfectly copied the exact tone I had used earlier that night. Then it repeated a sentence I remembered saying to dispatch hours before. Hearing my own voice come from that thing nearly shattered my nerves. It took one step toward me, then another. That's when survival instinct finally took over. Without thinking, I threw myself through the broken window and hit the ground outside as hard as I could. Then I got up and started running into the darkness of the forest without looking back. The moment my boots hit the forest floor, I ran harder than I had ever run in my entire life, crashing through bushes, jumping over fallen logs, and ignoring every branch that slapped against my face, because at that point I no longer cared about cuts, bruises, or even getting lost as long as I could put distance between myself and that cabin. And although I expected to hear something chasing me through the woods, the forest remained strangely quiet behind me, which somehow felt even worse because I couldn't tell whether the creature was following me or simply watching from a distance. And every few seconds I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those pale eyes staring back at me from the darkness. But there was never anything there except endless rows of trees illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. And as I continued running, my lungs began to burn from exhaustion, while cold air tore through my throat with every breath. Yet fear kept pushing me forward because the image of that impossible smile remained burned into my mind. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on finding my way out of the forest, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of that thing speaking in my voice, perfectly copying my words, as though it had been standing beside me all night, listening to every conversation I had. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no idea how long it might have been watching me before I ever entered that cabin, which was a thought so disturbing that I immediately forced myself to stop thinking about it and concentrate on surviving. After what felt like 20 minutes of non-stop running, I finally slowed down enough to catch my breath and get my bearings. But the moment I stopped moving, I noticed something that made my stomach twist into a knot, because despite all the distance I believed I had covered, the forest around me looked exactly the same as it had before. And I don't mean similar in the way that most forests naturally look alike. I mean identical, right down to a large split pine tree standing beside a moss-covered boulder that I distinctly remembered passing nearly 10 minutes earlier. And when I scanned my flashlight around the area, I found several more landmarks that looked painfully familiar, causing a wave of panic to spread through me, because it felt as though the forest itself was refusing to let me leave. And although exhaustion and stress could make people lose their sense of direction, this felt different, almost intentional, as if something was carefully guiding me in circles while allowing me to believe I was making progress. And for the first time that night, I genuinely questioned whether I would ever find my way back to the trailhead again. Trying to stay calm, I pulled out my compass and checked the direction I had been traveling, only to discover that the needle was spinning slowly without settling on any heading at all, which should have been impossible because even damaged compasses don't usually behave that way. And I found myself staring at it for several seconds, hoping it would correct itself, but the needle continued rotating lazily as though it had forgotten how magnetism worked. And when I looked up from the compass, I noticed something else that immediately raised the hairs on the back of my neck, because there were footprints in the dirt a few yards ahead of me, and at first I assumed they were mine, until I crouched down and examined them more closely, only to realize that they were much larger than any human footprint should be, with oddly elongated impressions that looked almost like bare feet stretched into unnatural proportions. And what truly terrified me was the fact that the tracks appeared fresh, as though whatever had made them had passed through only moments earlier. I followed the footprints with my flashlight, expecting them to disappear into the darkness like any normal trail would, but instead they led directly toward a cluster of trees standing close together near the edge of a shallow ravine. And as I approached, I noticed dozens of deep scratches carved into the bark of nearly every trunk in the area, some reaching higher than any person could reasonably reach without climbing. And many of them looked recent, exposing pale wood beneath the dark outer layers of bark, while others appeared weathered and old, as though they had been there for decades. And standing among those trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto some kind of territory marker, a place that belonged to something that didn't want visitors. And the silence surrounding the grove felt almost oppressive, as though even the wildlife knew better than to come near it. Then I heard the whistle again, but this time it wasn't coming from somewhere distant in the woods. It was coming from directly above me, and the realization hit me so suddenly that I nearly dropped my flashlight while instinctively shining it toward the treetops, where countless branches intertwined against the night sky. And for several seconds I saw nothing unusual, until the beam landed on a shape crouched among the limbs of an enormous pine tree. And the moment the light touched it, the shape moved with shocking speed, slipping behind the trunk so quickly that I couldn't make out more than a pale blur. But that was enough, because I knew exactly what I had seen. And whatever that thing was, it had been watching me from above without making the slightest sound, which somehow felt far more frightening than seeing it standing on the ground. Adrenaline surged through me again, and I immediately backed away from the tree line, refusing to take my eyes off the branches overhead, because every instinct told me losing sight of the creature was dangerous. And as I moved, I kept expecting it to leap down or rush toward me. But instead, the whistle came once more from somewhere deeper within the forest, followed by another whistle farther away, and then another, until the sound seemed to surround me from every direction at once, creating the unsettling impression that there might be more than one creature out there, an idea I desperately tried to reject, because dealing with a single monster was terrifying enough. And yet the possibility lingered in the back of my mind while the whistles continued echoing through the darkness like signals being exchanged between unseen hunters. I forced myself to keep moving and eventually reached a narrow creek cutting through the forest floor where cold water rushed over smooth stones beneath the moonlight, and for a brief moment the sight of something normal almost felt comforting, but that feeling vanished when I noticed a small object lying near the water's edge, partially buried beneath wet leaves, and when I picked it up, my chest tightened because it was a ranger badge, old and heavily tarnished, but unmistakably authentic, and after wiping away the dirt, I managed to read the engraved name on the front, only to discover that it belonged to a ranger who had reportedly disappeared in these woods nearly 30 years earlier, a case that had become local legend because neither the man nor his body had ever been found despite extensive search efforts. Holding that badge in my hand made the entire situation feel far more real, because until that moment, a small part of me still wanted to believe there was some rational explanation hiding behind everything I had experienced, but finding evidence connected to a decades-old disappearance shattered that illusion completely, and I suddenly found myself wondering how many of the names carved inside the cabin belonged to people who had never made it home. How many families had spent years searching for answers that never came, and whether Michael Turner had become one more name added to that endless list. And as those thoughts raced through my mind, I heard a faint splash somewhere upstream, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone walking through shallow water. At first, I thought it might actually be another person, perhaps a lost hiker or even Michael himself, and despite everything that had happened, I felt a surge of hope because the idea of finding another human being out there seemed almost miraculous. But that hope disappeared the moment I aimed my flashlight towards the source of the sound and saw a tall figure standing knee-deep beneath the moonlight, perfectly motionless. And unlike my earlier glimpses, this one didn't vanish when illuminated, instead remaining completely still while staring directly at me from a distance of perhaps 40 yards. And even from that far away, I could tell there was something horribly wrong about its proportions, something unnatural about the way its arms hung at its sides. And then, in the voice identical to Michael Turner's, it quietly asked for help. Hearing Michael's voice come from that creature was one of the most disturbing moments of my entire life, because it sounded exactly like the terrified man who had contacted me over the radio hours earlier, and for a split second I almost believed that somehow he was still alive and trapped inside whatever nightmare this forest contained. But then the figure smiled, revealing that same impossibly wide grin I had seen in the cabin, and any lingering doubt vanished instantly as it began taking slow steps through the creek toward me without breaking eye contact, while continuing to call my name in Michael's voice, and then switching seamlessly into my brother's voice, and then my mother's voice, cycling through them as casually as someone changing radio stations. And at that moment, I realized something horrifying. The creature wasn't merely copying people it had encountered, it was collecting them, carrying fragments of every victim inside itself like trophies. And as it continued approaching through the moonlit water, I understood that if I didn't find a way out of those woods soon, my voice might become the next one it stole forever. The creature kept moving toward me through the creek with a slow confidence that somehow made it even more terrifying than if it had charged at me, because predators usually chase when they think their prey might escape, but this thing behaved as if it already knew exactly how the night was going to end. And as it stepped through the water, it continued cycling through voices with unsettling ease, switching from Michael's terrified pleas to my brother's calm reassurance, and then to my mother's gentle tone, each one perfectly accurate, as though the creature carried entire recordings of their personalities inside its head, and every word felt designed to pull at some emotional weakness hidden deep inside me.
But despite the fear clouding my thoughts, I forced myself to remember the message carved into the wall of the cabin, the one that warned me not to follow it. And that warning suddenly seemed far more important than ever, because I realized the creature wasn't simply hunting people physically, it was manipulating them psychologically, using familiar voices to lure them into making fatal decisions. And once I understood that, I stopped listening to the words entirely and focused only on putting distance between us. I turned and ran again, splashing through the creek and scrambling up the opposite bank while my boots slipped against wet rocks and loose dirt, and for several terrifying seconds I expected to feel a hand grab my shoulder or hear the sound of something crashing through the forest behind me, but neither happened. And when I finally risked a glance backward, I saw the creature still standing in the middle of the water, watching me leave without making any attempt to follow, which somehow disturbed me more than a direct pursuit would have, because it suggested that the thing either didn't need to chase me or knew something I didn't. And that realization lingered in my mind as I pushed deeper into the darkness, trying desperately to find any sign of a trail, a road, or anything else that might lead me back to civilization before whatever game the creature was playing reached its conclusion. The forest seemed different now, almost as if the landscape itself was changing around me, because areas that should have been dense with undergrowth suddenly opened up into strangely empty clearings, while familiar landmarks appeared where they shouldn't have existed. And several times I found myself stopping to stare at objects that looked painfully out of place, including rusted tools hanging from tree branches, pieces of old clothing caught on bushes, and once even a weathered bicycle leaning against a pine tree with its tires long since rotted away. And each discovery felt less like random litter and more like evidence of people who entered the woods and never left, leaving fragments of their lives behind to slowly decay beneath the trees. And with every strange item I encountered, the feeling grew stronger that the forest was filled with stories no one would ever hear, stories that ended in silence decades before I arrived. Eventually, I stumbled into another clearing, but this one immediately felt different from the others because the ground was unnaturally bare, devoid of grass, leaves, or even fallen branches, and in the center stood a circle of massive stones arranged with such precision that it was obvious they had been placed there intentionally, though by whom and for what purpose I couldn't begin to guess. And as I cautiously approached the formation, I noticed symbols carved into the surfaces of the stones, symbols worn smooth with time, yet still visible beneath layers of moss and dirt. And although I didn't recognize any of them, their presence filled me with a deep sense of unease, because they suggested that people had known about whatever inhabited these woods long before modern maps, ranger stations, or hiking trails existed. While examining the carvings, I heard movement beyond the edge of the clearing and instinctively swung my flashlight toward the sound, expecting to see the creature again. But instead, I spotted what appeared to be a person standing between two trees several yards away, and unlike the pale figure from the creek, this silhouette looked completely normal, dressed in outdoor clothing and holding what appeared to be a flashlight of its own. And for a brief moment, relief washed over me, because the sight of another human being felt almost unbelievable after everything I'd experienced. But before I could call out, the figure slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the stone circle, and something about the gesture immediately reminded me of the creature in the cabin, causing my relief to vanish as quickly as it had appeared.
I blinked, and the figure was gone, disappearing so completely that it seemed as though it had never been there at all. and the sudden absence left me staring into empty darkness while a cold knot formed in my stomach, because I had become painfully aware that nothing in the forest could be trusted anymore. Not voices, not appearances, and certainly not my own assumptions. And as I stood there trying to decide what to do next, I noticed something lying at the base of one of the stones, partially hidden beneath leaves and dirt. And when I brushed the debris away, I discovered a weathered notebook sealed inside a plastic bag, miraculously preserved despite years of exposure to the elements. The notebook belonged to a ranger named Daniel Harper, whose disappearance I vaguely remembered hearing about during my early years in the service. And although the pages were stained and fragile, much of the writing remained readable, allowing me to piece together fragments of his final days. And the deeper I read, the more unsettled I became, because his experiences mirrored my own with disturbing accuracy, including reports of hearing whistles at night, becoming lost in familiar areas, encountering voices that mimicked loved ones, and repeatedly finding his way back to locations he was trying to leave. And according to his notes, he eventually concluded that the forest wasn't merely haunted or inhabited by some unknown animal, but that certain areas seemed capable of influence and perception itself, trapping people inside a maze of manipulated sights and sounds until they could no longer distinguish reality from deception. Near the end of the notebook, Daniel's handwriting became increasingly frantic, with sentences crossing over one another and entire pages filled with warnings written in large, uneven letters. And among those warnings, one statement appeared again and again, as though he desperately wanted anyone who found the journal to remember it. "It learns from you." And the repetition of that phrase chilled me because it aligned perfectly with everything I had witnessed so far, especially the way the creature copied voices and personal memories, suggesting that each encounter allowed it to gather more information about its victims. And as I stared at those words, I couldn't shake the horrifying possibility that the creature already knew far more about me than I realized. The final pages contained a rough map of the forest with several locations marked in red ink, including the abandoned cabin, the stone circle, and a point labeled simply as the Hollow, which Daniel had circled repeatedly until the paper nearly tore. And beside the marking, he had written that every strange occurrence seemed connected to that place, describing it as the center of whatever intelligence lurked within the woods. And although his notes ended abruptly before explaining exactly what he found there, the implication was clear enough to make my pulse quicken, because I finally had a possible lead, a location that might explain the disappearances, the voices, and perhaps even provide a way out. As I folded the notebook and slipped it into my backpack, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rattling the treetops above and scattering leaves across the ground. And for the first time all night, I heard something other than whistles, footsteps, or eerie voices, because far in the distance, barely audible through the forest, came the faint howl of a siren. And the sound filled me with a surge of hope so intense it almost hurt, since it meant search teams might finally be looking for me. But that hope lasted only a few seconds before another sound emerged from the darkness beyond the stones, a low chorus of whistles rising together from multiple directions at once. And as the eerie notes echoed through the trees, I realized with growing dread that the creature wasn't alone anymore, because whatever lived in those woods had heard the siren too, and it seemed determined to reach me before any rescuers could. The whistles grew louder with every passing second until they seemed to come from every corner of the forest at once, echoing between the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine how many creatures were out there or how close they actually were.
and as I stood in the middle of the stone circle gripping Daniel Harper's notebook with trembling hands, I suddenly understood why so many experienced hikers, hunters, and even trained rangers had disappeared in these woods over the years without leaving behind clear explanations, because whatever intelligence controlled this place wasn't relying on brute force alone. It was patient, intelligent, and capable of slowly wearing down a person's confidence until they could no longer trust their own senses. And now that intelligence seemed fully aware of where I was, because the whistles no longer sounded random but coordinated, almost like signals exchanged between hunters surrounding trapped prey. And the realization sent a fresh surge of fear through me as I tightened my grip on my flashlight and prepared myself to move before the unseen circle around me could close completely. Remembering Daniel's rough map inside Daniel's notebook, I quickly found the marked route leading toward the location labeled the Hollow. And although every rational part of my mind argued that heading deeper into the forest was probably the worst possible decision, another part recognized that simply wandering aimlessly had gotten me nowhere all night, and if Daniel had been right about the connection between that place and the strange events surrounding the disappearances, then reaching it might be my only chance of understanding what was happening and finding a way out. And so I left the stone circle behind and began moving through the darkness once again, following the faded directions while the whistles continued in the distance, sometimes fading away and sometimes growing so close that they seemed to brush against the edges of my hearing like invisible fingers, constantly reminding me that I was being watched. The terrain gradually changed as I moved farther from the clearing, becoming steeper and more difficult to navigate, with twisted roots crossing the ground like giant veins and thick patches of fog gathering between the trees despite the lack of any nearby water source. And after nearly an hour of careful travel, I began noticing something deeply unsettling, because the forest itself seemed older here. Not merely in terms of the age of the trees, but in a way that felt almost impossible to describe, as though I had crossed into a section of wilderness untouched by normal time, where every trunk appeared impossibly massive and every shadow stretched farther than it should, creating an atmosphere so oppressive that even breathing felt slightly more difficult. And with each step, the sensation intensified until I felt less like I was hiking through Montana and more like I was entering a place that did not belong entirely to the modern world. Eventually, I reached the edge of a large depression in the landscape, a vast hollow hidden beneath the forest canopy that wasn't marked on any map I'd ever seen. And standing there looking down into it, I immediately understood why Daniel had given it such a simple name, because no other description seemed necessary, as the hollow appeared almost unnatural in its shape, descending sharply into a basin where dense fog churned like smoke above the ground, obscuring whatever lay below. And although the sight alone was disturbing enough, what truly caught my attention was the complete absence of sound, because the whistles had stopped, the wind had stopped, and even my own footsteps seemed strangely muted, leaving behind a silence so absolute that it felt less like quiet and more like pressure pressing against my ears. Carefully descended into the hollow, moving slowly down the uneven slope while keeping my flashlight pointed ahead, and as I entered the fog, my visibility dropped dramatically until I could barely see more than a few yards in front of me, forcing me to rely on instinct and memory to maintain my direction. And the deeper I went, the colder the air became, far colder than it should have been for that time of year, until every breath emerged as a visible cloud, and frost began forming along the edges of fallen branches. and then through the shifting fog, I noticed shapes scattered across the basin floor, dozens of them standing motionless in the darkness, and for one horrifying moment I thought they were people, only to discover as I approached that they were crude figures made from sticks, bones, scraps of clothing, and other objects gathered from the forest, arranged to resemble human forms and positioned in silent rows facing the center of the hollow.
The center of the hollow contained a single enormous tree unlike anything I had ever seen before. A towering giant whose trunk was wider than some buildings and whose branches disappeared into darkness high above. And the moment my flashlight touched its bark, I noticed thousands of carvings covering its surface from the roots all the way upward. Names, dates, messages, and symbols layered over one another through what appeared to be generations of desperate attempts to leave behind some record of existence. And as I moved closer, I recognized several names from the cabin walls, including Michael Turner and Daniel Harper, along with countless others stretching back decades. And standing before that impossible tree, I felt an overwhelming sense that I was looking at a monument created not by a community or a culture, but by fear itself. A record left by those who had entered the forest and never returned. Then I heard movement behind me, followed by another sound to my left and another somewhere deeper within the fog, and when my flashlight touched them, I saw pale figures emerging from the mist one after another. Tall silhouettes with elongated limbs and featureless expressions stepping silently between the rows of crude effigies. And there were far more of them than I had feared. Dozens at least, perhaps even hundreds hidden beyond the limits of visibility, all watching me with the same unsettling stillness. And despite their numbers, none of them advanced immediately because their attention appeared focused on the enormous tree at the center of the hollow, as though they were waiting for something. And that realization filled me with a level of dread I can barely describe, because it suggested the creatures themselves might not be at the top of whatever hierarchy existed within those woods. A low creaking sound suddenly echoed through the hollow, causing every figure around me to become perfectly motionless. And at first I assumed the noise came from the wind shifting the massive branches overhead. But then I noticed the enormous tree itself was moving, not swaying naturally, but slowly twisting as though something inside the trunk was waking from a long sleep. And cracks spread across sections of bark, while deep groaning sounds emerged from within the wood. And as the fog churned around the roots, I became aware of an intelligence far older and larger than the creatures surrounding me, something that seemed connected to every strange event I had witnessed throughout the night. And in that moment, I finally understood the terrifying truth. The creatures were not the source of the voices, the disappearances, or the manipulations. They were extensions of whatever lived within the tree. The realization hit me at the same time another sound reached the hollow from far above, the distant roar of helicopter engines cutting through the night sky. And unlike the siren earlier, this sound was unmistakable, because search and rescue helicopters occasionally operated in the park during emergencies. And the moment the noise echoed overhead, the figures surrounding me reacted for the first time, turning their heads upward in perfect unison, while the whistles returned in a frenzy of overlapping notes, creating a chaotic chorus that seemed driven by urgency rather than confidence. And without fully understanding why, I sprinted toward the opposite side of the hollow as fast as exhaustion would allow, weaving between the rows of effigies while branches snapped beneath my boots. And behind me, the whistles grew louder and more frantic, accompanied by movement from every direction as the pale figures finally began to give chase.
I don't remember much about the final minutes because fear and adrenaline blurred everything together, but I remember climbing through thick brush, falling repeatedly, hearing helicopters overhead, and shouting until my throat felt raw. And eventually, powerful searchlights pierced the darkness between the trees, while voices called out from somewhere ahead. And the next thing I clearly recall is waking up in a hospital bed nearly 2 days later, surrounded by exhausted rescue personnel, who told me they had found me unconscious near the edge of the forest, several miles from the location where my truck had been abandoned. And according to them, there was no hollow, no giant tree, no stone circle, and no sign of the cabin I described, despite extensive searches of the area. Yet one detail continues to haunt me to this day, because when I emptied my backpack after the rescue, Daniel Harper's notebook was still inside, weathered, damaged, and completely real. And although most people dismissed my story as the result of exposure, exhaustion, and panic, I know what I saw out there. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world seems asleep, I still hear faint whistling beyond my bedroom window, drifting in from the darkness, patiently waiting, as if something deep in those woods remembers my voice and hasn't quite finished with me yet.